In the summer of 1941, the world held its breath as the largest invasion force in human history surged across the border into the Soviet Union. 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and a formidable air force. This was Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's ambitious plan to conquer the vast expanse of Russia in a matter of months. He famously declared, "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." But the door didn't just hold, it slammed shut, trapping the invaders in a nightmare that would ultimately seal the fate of the Third Reich. So what went so disastrously wrong? Why did this seemingly unstoppable war machine grind to a halt and ultimately shatter on the Eastern Front? It wasn't just one single mistake, but a cascade of catastrophic errors in judgment, logistics, and a fundamental underestimation of their enemy. Let's start with the core of the plan itself. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. This strategy had worked wonders in Poland and France, relying on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force to encircle and destroy enemy armies before they could even react. The German High Command believed they could replicate this success in Russia. The plan was a three-pronged attack. Army Group North would drive towards Leningrad, Army Group Center would push for the ultimate prize, Moscow, and Army Group South would secure the resource-rich lands of Ukraine. The initial stages were shockingly successful. Soviet forces, caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the assault, suffered staggering losses. In the first few weeks, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured, and German panzer divisions raced hundreds of miles into enemy territory. It looked like Hitler's prediction might just come true. But Russia isn't France or Poland. The first colossal miscalculation was geography. The sheer scale of the country is almost impossible to comprehend. As the German armies advanced, their supply lines stretched longer and longer, becoming dangerously thin and vulnerable. The concept of lightning war depends on a constant, rapid flow of fuel, ammunition, and food, but the roads in the Soviet Union were abysmal, many of them little more than dirt tracks. When the autumn rains came, a phenomenon the Russians call Rasputitsa. These roads turned into impassable seas of mud. Tanks, trucks, and supply columns became hopelessly bogged down. The Blitzkrieg, a strategy built on speed, was literally stuck in the mud. An advance that was measured in dozens of miles per day slowed to a crawl, and then, in some places, stopped altogether. This logistical nightmare was compounded by a second fatal assumption, that the Soviet Union would collapse politically once its main armies were defeated. Hitler and his generals viewed the Soviet state as a fragile, unpopular regime held together only by fear. They believed that once the Red Army was broken, the people would rise up against Stalin, or the state would simply disintegrate. They couldn't have been more wrong. Instead of collapsing, the invasion ignited a firestorm of patriotism. Stalin, despite his own brutal purges just years earlier, rallied the nation with powerful appeals to defend Mother Russia. The conflict was framed not as a political struggle, but as a fight for national survival, what the Russians would come to call the Great Patriotic War. This wasn't just a war against an army. It was a war against an entire people who were now motivated by a powerful desire to defend their homeland at any cost. Furthermore, the Germans completely misunderstood the Soviet capacity for industrial mobilization. They believed that once they captured the Western industrial centers, the Soviet war machine would be crippled. But they failed to account for one of the most incredible logistical feats in history. Even as the Germans advanced, the Soviets were dismantling entire factories, hundreds of them, and moving them brick by brick, piece by piece, on thousands of trains over the Ural Mountains into the safety of the interior. There, far beyond the reach of German bombers, they were reassembled and were soon churning out tanks, planes, and guns at a rate that stunned the German leadership. The famous T-34 tank, a design that was superior to most German panzers at the time, began to appear on the battlefield in ever-increasing numbers, a product of this relocated industrial might. Germany was fighting a war of attrition it simply couldn't win. And then came the winter. If the autumn mud was bad, the Russian winter was a force of nature beyond anything the German army had prepared for. Hitler had been so confident of a quick victory that the troops were not issued proper winter clothing. Soldiers were still in their summer uniforms as temperatures plummeted to -30, even -40 degrees Celsius. Frostbite caused more casualties than combat. Weapons froze solid, oil in engines turned to sludge, and tanks became immobile steel coffins. The German army, the most technologically advanced military in the world, was being defeated not by a superior army, but by General Winter. The Soviets, on the other hand, were accustomed to these conditions. Their soldiers were equipped with warm coats, felt boots, and their equipment was designed to function in the extreme cold. The tide began to turn. The strategic objectives were also a source of fatal conflict and confusion. While the generals wanted to focus all their strength on capturing Moscow, believing it was the political and logistical heart of the Soviet Union, Hitler repeatedly diverted crucial tank armies. In late summer, he ordered Army Group Centers Panzers to turn south to help with the encirclement of Soviet forces near Kyiv. While this resulted in a massive tactical victory, capturing over 600,000 prisoners, it was a strategic disaster. It cost the Germans precious time. The window to take Moscow before the winter set in was closing fast. By the time the assault on the capital, codenamed Operation Typhoon, was finally launched in October, it was too late. The Rasputitsa had begun, and the first snows were already falling. The delay proved fatal. The offensive stalled just a few dozen miles from the Kremlin, with German soldiers reportedly able to see the spires of the city in the distance. Finally, we cannot ignore the sheer human element. The German underestimation of the Red Army soldier was profound. They viewed them as an undisciplined, poorly led mob. But while the Red Army suffered from poor leadership in the early stages, the ordinary soldier fought with a tenacity and resilience that shocked the invaders. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and their very existence. This desperation, combined with the vast manpower reserves of the Soviet Union, meant that no matter how many casualties they inflicted, there always seemed to be more soldiers to take their place. The Germans were bleeding men and machines they could not replace, while the Soviets, despite horrific losses, could absorb the blows and keep fighting. The final nail in the coffin of Operation Barbarossa came in December 1941. Just as the German offensive on Moscow had ground to a frozen halt, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive. Fresh, well-equipped divisions, including elite Siberian troops accustomed to winter warfare, were transferred from the Far East. They smashed into the exhausted, frozen German lines, pushing them back from the capital. For the first time in the war, the German army was not advancing. It was in a full-scale retreat. The myth of its invincibility was shattered. In the end, the failure of Operation Barbarossa was not due to a single cause, but a perfect storm of arrogance, poor planning, and a complete misunderstanding of the enemy and the environment. Overconfidence led to a plan that banked on a quick victory. Faulty intelligence underestimated Soviet industrial power and popular resolve. Terrible logistics left an army stranded deep in enemy territory, and a brutal disregard for the climate led to an entire army freezing to death at the gates of its objective. This failure on the Eastern Front was the beginning of the end. It opened up a war of attrition that Germany could never hope to win, and it set the stage for the eventual downfall of Hitler's regime. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this historical deep dive interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this. We love exploring the turning points of history, and your support makes it all possible. See you in the next video.